Right, hello guys, welcome back. So in today's video, I have a brand new Prismatic Hunter build that, as the title says, completely forgets combination blow and instead replaces it with a brand new setup that I believe is much more fun than the Punch Hunter build that we are all so used to at this point. After having tested this setup in the brand new Liminality GM, Expert Lost Sectors, and in general play, I am very confident in saying that this is the most fun I've had on Prismatic Hunter in quite some time, because frankly, I was getting quite bored of the punch setup. So what is the goal of this build? Well, the first thing is to provide an alternative playstyle to the Punch Hunter we've been so used to. We are doing away with combination blow and building more into ranged combat, putting heavy emphasis onto grenade and melee synergy, where every melee kill will feed back into our grenades, then our grenade feeds back into our melee, and of course, both of our grenade and melee options are ranged. So let's get into how the build works. For starters, this build does use exotic class items. Now I know that might be something that turns you guys away, however, we don't use just one. In fact, there are several that will work quite well. So fret not if you don't have one, because another will probably suffice quite nicely. At base though, we will need Spirit of Caliban, as it's very important for the loop, but in terms of what else you can pair it with, Spirit of the Certarachne, Synthoceps, or Verity work very nicely here, for reasons I will explain shortly. Though the example you'll be seeing with most of the gameplay in this video will be with Caliban Synthoceps. So let's get into how the build works. Basically, the aim of this build is to spam the Threaded Spike melee as well as Gunpowder Gamble. These two are our main abilities that we're going to be looping back to back. And as you can see, we are completely foregoing any sort of close range options other than Ascension, but I will explain why we have picked Ascension when we get to that. So starting with our other main abilities, we have Golden Gun. This is mainly for the fact that it is one of the best supers that Prismatic Hunter can get, and also to give us restoration with passive purpose whenever we pick up an orb. I also have Marksman Dodge on here because it has the lowest cooldown, which means we can proc Ascension most frequently. Of course, we then have our Threaded Spike, which is the signature melee ability. This is actually a very powerful melee ability, and if you haven't used it yet, I would strongly encourage you trying it, because especially with Spirit of Synthoceps, this thing does a lot of damage and from a very far away range. Next, we are taking Swarm Grenade. The grenade choice is kind of up to you, but the reason I am taking Swarm Grenade is just because it did get a buff in the final shape. You could also take Arc Bolt Grenade here, but I just like Swarm Grenade over all of the other options. Grapple is nice, but we are going for a ranged emphasis, so that's why I am not taking Grapple here. Again, you can take it if you want, but I'm just going for a ranged option. Then for our aspects, of course, we have Gunpowder Gamble. This is actually a very underrated aspect. It does a lot of damage and it stuns unstoppable champions because it does technically cause an ignition, especially with the artifact mods that we're going to talk about later. This will be improved very heavily. While on the topic of Gunpowder Gamble, the reason that Spirit of Caliban is mandatory here is because ignitions contribute a lot to the Gunpowder Gamble meter. In fact, they contribute 3 points out of 6 to the meter. And since we're also going to be getting ability kills with our Threaded Spike that triggers those ignitions, one throw of our Threaded Spike should be enough to fully charge our Gunpowder Gamble every time. Next up, we are taking Ascension. Now, a lot of you may be looking at this and saying, why don't I take something like Winter Shroud? It gives a bit of damage resistance and my dodge also recharges faster with this, so I could perhaps use Gambler's Dodge to get my knife back if I don't get it back after catching it. However, the emphasis of this build is on range, and now you might be saying, well, Ascension isn't a very ranged ability, you have to be close range to use it. Yes, that is true, but another big reason why I'm taking Ascension here is because it's just a very easy way to get amplified. The best way that I think about this is that it's an amplified button. So basically, whenever you want to get amplified, you can just press this and you'll have it there almost all the time, because your dodge regen is very fast, especially with Facet of Hope here. Plus, this season we have access to the Galvanic Armor artifact mod, which is a 30% damage resistance for simply being amplified on a Prismatic or Arc subclass. So you can think about it as an amplified button, yes, but also just as a 30% DR button. So if you're running around and you feel like you're taking a lot of damage, just press your Ascension and then you've got another 30% damage resist, which you can just run around with and be a little safer. And also for the fact that Ascension is just a really cool aspect, I just think it's pretty fun to mess around with. And also, just one more thing, kills with Ascension will count towards Gunpowder Gamble charges because of the jolt that it causes. So now let's move on to the fragments. First of all, we have Facet of Blessing here, which is going to make it so melee kills begin health regeneration, and while Transcendent, melee final blows will start health regeneration for you and nearby allies. This is just to make it so that our melee ability heals us whenever we throw it, because we are going to be getting lots of kills with it, especially if you pair it with Spirit of Synthos to make it deal a lot of damage. With Spirit of Synthos, it's basically guaranteed that even at Grandmaster level content, the Threaded Spike will one-shot any red bar enemy. Moving on, we have Facet of Protection. This is just so when we are surrounded by enemies, it will give us a 15% damage resistance on top of everything else we have. With the way that the build is played, we aren't going to be that aggressive, but when we are near enemies, it's just going to give us that little bump. Next, we have Facet of Purpose, which is just here to give us restoration every time we pick up an orb, so it's just going to be our constant healing source. course, Facet of Ruin here is going to increase the size of our ignitions that we deal with our Gunpowder Gamble. As I alluded to earlier, Facet of Hope is just here to improve the cooldown of our Ascension. I believe it's about 60% here whenever we have an elemental buff, which we will have all the time from things like Amplified from Ascension, or Radiant from Radiant Orbs, or Restoration from Facet of Purpose. The list goes on. You're basically never going to run out of an elemental buff, so Facet of Hope is going to be active 24/7. Finally, we have Facet of Dawn here. This is more of a future-proofing fragment. You could swap this for something else this season because of Radiant Orbs. However, this is just going to make us Radiant every time we get a hit with our Threaded Spike, and because we are not going to be pushing enemies that much, we're not going to be picking up orbs as often as, say, the Punch Hunter would, so having Facet of Dawn here is slightly more beneficial than simply relying only on Radiant Orbs. So that does it for the subclass. Let's talk about stats and armor. So of course, we are going to be wanting to maximize our resilience for the damage resist, then we're going to go into discipline, and then after that into mobility. I only have 10 recovery here, which you might be sort of gasping at, but we do improve that with some of the mods. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, you are going to be switching between lots of different exotic class items here, assuming they have Caliban, but I will have a separate section about that in just a moment. Weapons wise, we are actually taking Monte Carlo here, and the reason for that is because it's a very reliable way of getting our melee energy back. If, for say, in some cases we catch our dart and it doesn't fully give it back to us, or it only hit maybe like 2 enemies, we would need another way of getting our melee energy back very efficiently, which Monte Carlo can do, because especially if you have the catalyst, getting a melee kill, activating the catalyst, and then getting a melee kill with the glaive catalyst will give us around 50% of our melee energy back, which is just a very nice way of quickly getting said melee back. Next, I'm taking the Solar Rocket Sidearm Aberrant Action with Heal Clip Incandescent. Heal Clip is just going to be another very convenient source of healing, and Incandescent is just good for proccing kills, and because it's solar, it's just going to charge our Gunpowder Gamble passively whenever we get kills with it. Albeit the progress is less, you only get 1 point per kill if it's a solar weapon, but still it's charging it nonetheless. In your heavy slot, I just have a sword just for general play, because a lot of your kills are going to be with abilities, but if you're in a boss encounter, just swap it for your favorite boss dealing weapon. Could be Thunderlord, could be a rocket, could be Microcosm, whatever. Mods wise, I'm taking 2 Siphon mods, Kinetic to make orbs if I want to get kills with Monte Carlo, Solar here if I'm getting kills with Aberrant Action, and then I have Ashes to Assets to get me bonus super energy on my kills with Gunpowder Gamble. Then for the gloves, we have Heavy Handed here to make it so we create an orb every time we get a kill with our Threaded Spike every 10 seconds, Momentum Transfer to give us slightly more melee energy back whenever we deal damage with our Gunpowder Gamble, and Fastball to make it have a greater throw distance. Chest Piece, we just have General Reserve mods. Boots, we have Absolution to give us 5% of each of our abilities every time we pick up an orb, Recuperation to heal us, and then Invigoration to give another 10% of our melee ability every time we pick up an orb. Because we are not going to be using our dodge normally, and we're instead going to be using it for Ascension, we can't actually use a lot of on-dodge related mods, because unfortunately they don't work with Ascension. So instead, on the class item, I'm just taking mods that help the rest of the build. So I have Special Finisher here if we're running low on special for our Rocket Sidearm. I then have Time Dilation and Font of Restoration, because as you saw earlier, I only have 10 recovery, and just to improve the stats a little, I have gone for Font of Restoration, which is going to provide a passive 30 recovery whenever we have Armor Charge, which is why I've also taken Time Dilation to improve the length of the Font of Restoration. There really isn't much else you could go for here. As I said, none of these mods work with Ascension, unfortunately, so Distribution, Outreach, Bomber, Powerful Attraction, Reaper, none of them work with Ascension, so you really are limited for choice, but at the end of the day, it's not that important. The main thing is the actual perks you have on the class item here. Okay, so let's quickly gloss over the artifact mods that you're going to need for this build. In the third column here, I have Elemental Siphon to make it so whenever we get multi-kills with our Aberrant Action, it's just going to spawn the occasional Fire Sprite, which is going to improve the cooldown of our grenade. And as for the rest of the mods, we have Radiant Orbs here, which is going to make it so whenever we pick up an orb, it's going to give us Radiant. So if, for example, if we don't have our melee back, it's just another way of making ourselves Radiant, so we have that permanent 25% damage buff. Galvanic Armor, of course, for whenever we are amplified after proccing Ascension to give us that 30% damage resist. Solar Fulmination here, which is going to increase the damage and radius of our Gunpowder Gamble even more. Then in column 5, we have Shield Crush, which is going to make it so whenever we have Woven Mail, Frost Armor, or a Void Overshield, our melee will recharge faster. Unfortunately, we aren't going to have this first portion of the perk very often unless provided by a teammate. However, the second part, whenever we are amplified or radiant, our grenade will recharge faster and deal increased damage. Because we are going to be amplified and radiant all the time, it's just going to make our base grenade do 25% more damage. Also, fun fact about Shield Crush, this does work with Gunpowder Gamble by way of increasing its damage by 25% if you are amplified or radiant. Finally, we have Transference, which is going to make it so we gain increased grenade and melee damage while we are transcendent. Of course, we are going to lose the ability to use our Gunpowder Gamble whenever we are transcendent, which is a bit of a bummer. However, we are going to be able to take advantage of our Threaded Spike way more often than we could before, so having increased damage on that and regen is just very nice. Okay, so now that we've wrapped up the discussion on the build, I want to quickly touch on the choice of exotic class item here. Now, I know exotic class items can be a bit of a point of contention when it comes to making builds for Prismatic, because not a lot of people have the combos that people like myself would recommend them to use, which is why, like I said at the beginning of the video, there are 3 combos today that I do want to quickly touch on that will make this build good in different ways. So first things first, we have Spirit of Caliban and Spirit of Synthos. Now, Caliban, of course, is going to make our melees cause ignitions, which I've already explained why is important, because it's going to make our Gunpowder Gamble come back very quickly. So the second perk is where things can change a little bit. So starting with Spirit of Syntheseps, this is going to make it so our melee ability will deal 2.65x damage as long as we are surrounded by enemies. Now, I know I mentioned that this build is supposed to be played from range, but it is pretty easy to get relatively close to enemies and still not be in sort of the danger zone and get the benefit from Syntheseps, not to mention that it does linger for 5 seconds afterwards. This is a pretty strong option because it will one-shot most red bars in any level of content, even in GMs. So it's just going to make proccing those ignitions from Caliban even more guaranteed. So yes, this is a very good option, and I know people would probably have this cloak anyway if you are speccing your hunter into the punch build, because this is one of the 2 class items that pairs very nicely with that as well. The second option is having one with Caliban Certarachne. Now, unfortunately, this is one that I don't have, which I did want for this video. However, Certarachne is going to make it so whenever you throw your grenade, it will give you Woven Mail for 10 seconds, and this does work with Gunpowder Gamble. This is something I would probably take into higher level content just for the added benefit of Woven Mail, because if you think about it, Gunpowder Gamble is effectively a grenade that is on a 6 or maximum 10-second cooldown. So you basically have a very powerful grenade that is on a very short cooldown. You get 10 seconds of Woven Mail, and by the time that that Woven Mail is ended, you probably have your next Gunpowder Gamble ready, since the cooldown is only about 6 seconds. So you basically have constant uptime on Woven Mail while using the Gunpowder Gamble, which is pretty cool. I did mess with this class item quite a lot when initially coming up with the concept for this build, so it is quite potent, and if you happen to have one with Certarachne, I would definitely give that a try, or if you don't have the other options, this is definitely a very good one. Woven Mail is of course a 45% damage resistance for those of you that weren't aware. Finally, the last option is using Spirit of Verity in the second column. This is going to make it so whenever we get weapon kills that match our grenade, it's going to give us death throws, which will increase the damage of our grenade by 20% per stack at a maximum of 5 stacks. And now you might be wondering, does this work with Gunpowder Gamble? And yes, it does. It in fact doubles the damage of our Gunpowder Gamble. As you can see in the clip, our damage goes from around 54,000 to around 108,000 at death throws times 5. Now, if you add on another 25% from the artifact mod Shield Crush, this goes to around 130,000, which is pretty solid. So again, a very nice option for those of you that don't have the other 2 roles. Now, finally, how do you actually use this build effectively? Well, as I'm sure you've seen in most of the gameplay, you basically just want to be spamming your abilities. There's no real specific sequence of events of how to do this. Of course, just start with your Threaded Spike, get a few kills with that, get your Gunpowder Gamble, and then throw the Gunpowder Gamble. When it's off cooldown, you can throw your Spike again and just rinse repeat. If you think you're in a spot of trouble, pop your Ascension to give yourself a bit more damage resist and also jolt nearby enemies. Make sure you're picking up the orbs you create to get yourself Restoration and Radiant, and also charge back your melee ability if you don't manage to get it all back after catching it. And then whenever you come to a heftier target, just pop your Golden Gun and pop a few shots into it. But that's basically the entire gist of the build. As always, there will be a dim link to this build in the description if you want to try it yourself. I highly recommend you do give it a try, because I'm sure for a lot of you, like me, have gotten pretty bored, or at least wanting to play something different than the Punch Hunter build that we are, again, so very much used to. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. If you made it this far, thank you so much. Your support means the world. And if you're really into the content I create, consider becoming a member of the channel, which not only lets you support me in the best way possible, it also nets you a whole host of awesome perks along with it. A massive shout out to these members up on screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now, dear viewer.